Well, hello everyone. I've never done anything like this. I'm probably going to hate it, but uh, we'll find out. I've just seen a lot of people, whether it be in the Facebook group I belong to called Central Kansas Vinyl Collectors, or whether it just be people I personally know. Um, Lately, maybe it's due to boredom, just because of loss of jobs, quarantining, not being able to get out as much. People are looking for new music, and I know a few people that are trying to find their way into jazz, and it is a daunting task. I had a really hard time at first determining, just finding your way. There's so much jazz. That's such a multifaceted genre, whether it be jazz fusion, jazz rock, funk, soul jazz. There's early jazz, modal, hard bop. It's just there's so much of it, and it's so hard for me to get into. So I'm not going to tell you that I have the jazz that will pique your interest, that will find your um, needs, what you're looking for in jazz. But I tried to assemble as you can see, a decent stack of lesser household names, but still very accessible jazz albums that I love. And that's exactly what these are. They're what I love. At the end of the day, you may not. And if that's the case, um, this video may not be for you, and I apologize. But I really tend to lean more towards the jazz funk, the jazz fusion. Not to say I don't love jazz in the more traditional sense of the term. I've got some of that in there too. But, if you don't find what you're looking for in here, I'm sorry. But I did ultimately make the decision to leave out some of the more, not the household names, but the household albums that just, when you say you're going to listen to jazz, that just immediately come to mind. Kind of Blue by Miles Davis. I'll touch on it right now. You should listen to it. It's a killer album. It's perfect in many ways, but you need to listen to that. That's essential listening. That's an industry-defining album. I'm going to try and break free of those, leave them out. Go listen to Giant Steps by John Coltrane. A Love Supreme. There's a number of those albums. Take Five by Dave Brubeck is one. So, that being said, they're left out. I'm going to dive into this stack. As you can see, it's kind of big. I don't know how long this video is going to be, but nobody's going to watch it if it's too long. So, I'm going to get started. This is one of my favorite live albums of all time. You're going to see three names on the cover. That's all it is. It's completely acoustic, recorded live. It's called Friday Night in San Francisco. It is all acoustic guitars. John McLaughlin, Al Di Meola, and Paco de Lucia. Al Di Meola at the time was of Return to Forever was probably his rise to fame with Chick Corea. John McLaughlin of the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and then Paco de Lucia, not as famous in America. I have a few of his albums. Many of them are Mexican pressings. But he's just a traditional Spanish flamenco guitarist, and it's killer. That's a lot of what this album is. So this is kind of a twofer, actually. This is the studio album that Paco de Lucia and Al Di Meola wrote. What to me on this album is the headline track, and that is called Mediterranean Sundance. It's a beautiful, beautiful acoustic guitar, flamenco, very heavily Latin influences. And it is a gorgeous album. Both of these. Definitely worth a listen. Cannot recommend them enough. Shouldn't have brought my coffee. It's in the way. So, I know a lot of people, at least that I've seen recently, trying to get into jazz are coming from a rock and roll background. And there's nothing wrong with that. I was born and raised on classic rock, and it's got an enormous spot in my heart. So, I wanted to throw in some jazz rock. And when I personally think of jazz rock, whether or not he's a household name, I think of Brian Auger, which my dear friend Gary Hess introduced me to. This is a live album by Brian Auger. This is a two-part series, live at the Whiskey A Go-Go. And this features one of my favorite songs of his that he also did on a studio album called Straight Ahead, and it's called Beginning Again. And it is such a great jazz rock track. Brian Auger might not have a voice that's loved by everyone. I really enjoy his voice. If you think vocals make this not jazz, maybe you're right. I would classify this album more as jazz rock. But either way, worth the listen. If you're coming from a jazz background, you're just trying to see if the water's fine, this is the album. This is a household name. George Benson had some commercial success. I think a lot of people know who George Benson is. Probably one of his bigger hits was Give Me the Night. um, off of, I can't remember what album. Doesn't matter. Maybe it's called Give Me the Diamond. This is a CTI release. CTI, probably going to touch on them way too much, and it may not be for everyone, but I know I've got a few in that stack. CTI to me is just one of those essential jazz record labels that doesn't get as much attention as something like when I think of jazz, Columbia. Of course, they had a lot of Miles Davis albums were on Columbia. A lot of Herbie Hancock was on Columbia. Of course, Blue Note. Tons of big stuff on Blue Note. Impulse. Um, these all come to mind. CTI sometimes get left in the dust because they did a fair amount of smooth jazz releases, which is not for everyone. That is not this. This is a heavy rotator in my house. CTI albums are always identifiable by this beautiful gatefold cover, nice, sturdy jackets, and then CTI always had killer side musicians. We got George Benson as the headliner on this album. Title track, White Rabbit, cover of Jefferson Airplane, excellent. But other notable artists on this album, Herbie Hancock on the keys, Ron Carter on bass, Hubert Laws featured on one song on the flute, Airto, Jay Berliner on acoustic guitar. He's not a household name. I just picked up an album by him on the Mercury label. It is incredible, funky. And then last but not least, Billy Cobham on drums. This is essential jazz listening. Give it a listen. So I touched on, I know, Dave Brubeck earlier. I think Take 5 is essential listening to his. Anyone should listen to it. There's a reason that album is such a highly regarded album in jazz, but this is another one to me that's just so essential. He did a whole series called Jazz Impressions of Blank. Eurasia, Europa, Japan, New York. This is Jazz Impressions of Japan. It's got a pretty heavy influence of Japanese music. I do believe it was recorded live in Japan, although don't hold me to that. Like I said, I don't have a script. I don't have any notes. Definitely liable to get some facts wrong in this video, so call me out if you want. Anyways, if this wasn't recorded in Japan, call me a liar. I would think it would be more obviously noted on the album, but that's okay. This is a killer album. It is, to me, Dave Brubeck's best, and I've got a lot of Dave Brubeck, and I do love Dave Brubeck. This is a Blue Note release. This is Donald Byrd, Street Lady. Donald Byrd had a pretty traditional start to jazz, played with a lot of different groups on Blue Note, had a lot of his own success as a solo artist. And in the 70s, he, as many other musicians did, started in the early 70s straying off towards that much funkier aspect of jazz. And he caught a decent bit of flack for it, I think, just because it was so different. And a lot of people thought he was selling out, trying to cater to the more commercially successful music of the time. That is not the case. This album is fantastic. Donald Byrd is a stellar trumpet player. Some great flute solos. I think flute is a very underrated instrument in jazz. I'll have some of that coming up. This is an important album. This is a good one. This is the Billy Cobham George Duke Band. And this, in addition to those two, features John Scofield on guitar and then Alphonso Johnson on the bass. Alphonso Johnson played with the Weather Report, which is one of the bigger names to me in jazz fusion. And Alphonso Johnson is a great bass guitarist. And this album is insanely good. George Duke did a decent bit of commercially successful songs. I would say, I think that a lot of you will recognize George Duke's name. He still makes music. There's a lot of great videos on YouTube of him playing in pretty recent history at jazz festivals, and he still gets with it. In the 70s, I feel like he did a lot of more forgettable disco albums that I'm not into, but this is, to me, kind of the peak of George Duke. He can hang with the best of them in the way of being a stellar keyboard player, so definitely worth listening. I'm going to say that about every one of these albums. I'm sorry. Okay, here we have Cortex. This is Tropo Blue. It's French. Forgive me, I totally butchered that. I imported this one from France. This is a brand new repress. The original pressing's pretty hard to come across. This is essential jazz fusion. It's got a decent bit of vocal background, very typical jazz fusion sound to me, though. Very funky, very easy to listen to, and it has been sampled a ton. Um, I wish I'd written down some of the people that had sampled this, but the number one that comes to mind is MF Doom. Has definitely sampled this album. Worth checking out. I think I got this shipped over from France for less than $40. Worth every penny. Larry Coryell. Kind of before the fusion boom, Larry Coryell was already making fusion. Maybe in the most basic sense of fusion. This really leans toward jazz rock once again. If you're coming from a rock background, Larry Coryell is a shredder on the guitar. There's specifically a track on this album that's a blues rock song. It's literally called The Oregon Blues. There's a song called Slow Blues. There's a song called Sex. And it is a fantastic album. Ron Carter on bass. Ron Carter was all over the place. Played with everyone. Stand-up bass, electric bass, whatever the case may be. He did it. And he's so good. This album will not disappoint. Whether you're into jazz, whether you're into fusion, whether you're into rock, worth the listen. This might be a household album. I threw it in because I don't think it gets quite the success of Kind of Blue. This is considered to be one of the staples of jazz fusion, and you'll see why. Almost every performer on this went on and had commercial success, whether it was as a solo artist, or whether it was in a jazz fusion group, or whether it was both. Let me go down this list. Herbie Hancock obviously had his own massive success. The Headhunters album. His success never stopped. Chick Corea, Return to Forever. Wayne Shorter was one of the founding members of the Weather Report, along with Joseph Sawinul, Dave Holland on bass, John McLaughlin on guitar. He went off, started Mahavishnu, and Tony Williams on drums. This is a perfect Miles Davis album. Okay, next one. I got 2 Miles Davis albums. Sorry about it. Actually, I'm not at all. This is On the Corner. I just recently got this one. It took me a while to get it, but this is Miles Davis essential listening to me. You have to know that on the background of this record, Miles Davis was really trying for something different. He was selling out, and a lot of people were mad at him. This had no commercial success at the time. He did a lot to try and give it commercial success, and it all backfired. So what did he do? For starters, he was trying to market it towards like James Brown listeners of the time. Your R&B, your soul, your funk. He was trying to leave back that real out there fusion and do something a little more accepted by, and he wanted it to be accepted by the black community. He didn't care if the white man remembered this album. And so at the time, it was widely regarded as pretty forgettable. But that's the beauty of vinyl records. Not that this album was forgotten. This wasn't buried. It's still by one of the most legendary trumpet players of all time. But the beauty of vinyl is that I think with these new companies here repressing records, they can recharge a record. They can bring it back, give it a new sense of vitality. They get their hands on the original analog tapes, they remaster it, they put it out, and boom, this album is more popular than it was ever in the 70s. So the other thing he did was he did not put any musicians list or instrumentation list on the back. It does not mention who plays what instrument or anything like that. He didn't want the critics to think about who was playing on it, what instruments were being played. A lot of the instruments have a decent bit of distortion. Just an unfamiliar sound. The whole album had a new, different sound. He was really pushing the envelope, and at the end of the day, I think it, at that point in time, was not widely accepted. Great album. Miles Davis on the Corner. Worth listening. Oh, another CTI release, Diodato. Killer album. I put this album here for one reason and one reason only. It has a cover of the theme song from 2001, A Space Odyssey, which was originally by Strauss, of course. It's a jazz cover. It is funky. Diodato is a killer jazz keyboard player. Now, other people to be of note on this album, First off, Rudy Van Gelder was the engineer on this album. If you're not familiar with audio engineers, he's one of the more legendary ones. Stanley Clark on electric bass, Jay Berliner on guitar, Billy Cobham on drums, Air 2 on percussion, and it's just a stacked album. It's got a full orchestra because they are covering an orchestral song, but it is as funky as they come. Diodato did a lot of good releases. I just recently picked up this one. This is a pretty modern colored vinyl reissue. Whatever pressing you can get your hands on of this. There are, $35 audiophile presses. This was $16, 180 gram repress. Whatever pressing you get your hand on, you will not regret it. This is a great album. Or even if you stream it. This was one of the first albums to really make an emphasis not only on having a really small group of musicians. There's only 3 people on this album. You got Mingus, Max Roach, and Duke Ellington. And it is perfect. It was one of the first albums to express the individuality of each musician doing absolutely whatever the hell they wanted. And it is so good. And it's just a cutting edge album in the individuality of jazz musicians recording together. That's one of the beauties of jazz. This is a little bit of a side tangent, but I listen to Steve Guttenberg a lot. He's an audiophile gearhead reviewer on YouTube that is also into music, as any audiophile should be. And one of the things that he touches on in jazz a lot, why he likes it so, not just jazz, but not modern. No, I'm not bashing modern music. I love it, but part of what makes this music so emotional and intimate is how it's recorded. It's recorded in one take. Oftentimes, these albums, they take 5 or 6 takes of one song, and the best cut made it to the album. So each one is recorded differently. The instrumentalists are playing different things because they're just feeding off of each other. And as a musician, I really feel that when one musician in your group starts really riding out a groove, you feel that. You have this intimate interplay. And when it's recorded in the studio and just directly pressed right to record, you get that same level of emotion in your house. And this is one of those albums that makes it well worth checking out. Another CTI release, I'm kind of go quick over this one. I see I've got quite a stack of records left. Joe Farrell, not a household name in jazz, but again, Herbie Hancock's on this album, Steve Gadd, Joe Beck. Joe Farrell's a jazz flute player. This is worth checking out. If jazz flute is something that interests you, I think jazz needs more flute, so worth checking out. This Christmas album, not everyone loves Christmas music. This is one of the finest Christmas albums of all time. A Charlie Brown Christmas. It was a network television special, and they contracted Vince Guaraldi to do the music for it. And this album holds a special place in my heart. I have it on CD. I have it on cassette. I have it on vinyl twice. It is true trio jazz. It is beautiful. I'm sure you've heard it. It's very recognizable. And it is worth listening. And here we have one of my favorite jazz saxophone players of all time. This is Stan Getz. Everyone, I think, should listen to, of course, The Girl from Ipanema. That whole album with Antonio Carlos Jobim and her name's escaping me. It'll come to me. Anyways, that album is worth listening to. It absolutely is. This is my favorite. Lorindo Almeida is another excellent flamenco Spanish guitarist, along with Charlie Bird, Paco de Lucia. This album's great. It is recorded beautifully. It sounds good. You should sit down and have an intimate listen with it, whether you're listening on AirPods or a system like this one. This is an album that is worth seeking out. I'm trying to put as much in here as I can. Just so many different albums, so maybe you can find something you like. I hope you're taking notes. This is David Grisman. This is Gypsy Jazz. Gypsy Jazz, generally, you would think Stefan Grappelli, Django Reinhardt. David Grisman is my personal favorite, at least so far. This is a fantastic album. Gypsy Jazz is a jazz feel. You got the walking upright bass line, but it's instrumentated more like bluegrass. Expect to hear mandolins, maybe banjos, a lot of acoustic guitar, some saxophone soloists. It's still jazz, but it is different. It's a trip. If you're into bluegrass at all, this is well worth a listen. I throw this one in because Jerry Hahn was local to Wichita. I don't believe here he lives any. I don't believe he lives here anymore. There's people that know way more about Jerry Hahn than I do. I know that I have Facebook friends that personally know Jerry Hahn pretty well, but I think this one's worth mentioning. Local artist. This one's from the mid '70s, probably considered to be one of his best releases. He also had the Jerry Hahn Brotherhood, and I have an album of his called the Jerry Hahn and His Quintet. All great albums. This might be the best one, the funkiest. He's a guitarist, and it is just a killer album. Herbie Hancock's up next. I see that. Herbie Hancock's essential albums, I think it goes without saying that Headhunters, the song Chameleon, the song Watermelon Man, that whole album is perfect in every sense of the term. Herbie Hancock got started with the Miles Davis Quintet. Herbie Hancock had his own beautiful solo career long before he also got into that 70s funk. He did some pretty out there stuff in the 70s. This is not. This is super straightforward. This is a Blue Note release. So forgive me. My cover is rough. I'd like to buy a reissue of this, a good audiophile repress. This is a fairly rough OG Blue Note first press. This is Herbie Hancock, The Prisoner. This is such an essential modal jazz album. I'd say this is as good as Kind of Blue. I think there's a lot of people that would disagree with me, but I think this is a killer one. Now, if we're going back a little bit more towards Herbie Hancock's funk era, this album is every bit as good to me as Headhunters. This is Manchild, similar era. It's similar level of mind-blowing funk jams, and a gorgeous harmonica solo featuring Stevie Wonder, if you're into that. I put Ramsey Lewis in here because he is such straightforward jazz. He is jazz for people that don't like jazz. It's so easy to listen to. It is never overwhelmingly out there. It's not avant-garde. It's not free in any form. It is so pleasant to listen to. He has so many albums. Start with his greatest hits. Start with The In Crowd. Start with Sun Goddess if you're looking for something a little funkier. It actually features Earth, Wind, and Fire. But I put this one here just because it is such a pleasant, beautiful album. Ramsey Lewis is in his 80s, still makes music today. The most notable song on this to me is My Sherry Amour, which is a Stevie Wonder cover. It is a beautiful, pleasant jazz song worth listening to. I've already touched on John McLaughlin a little bit. He was on Miles Davis's In a Silent Way. This is one of the best Mahavishnu releases. This was his fusion effort band. It has Miles Beyond, which is a Miles Davis cover. It is just such a good album. It's got Billy Cobham on drums, Jan Hammer on keyboard, and it is essential in the way of jazz fusion. Jazz fusion, again, is not going to be for everyone. So skip over that one if it's not your taste. Jazz Flute, Herbie Mann, live at the Village Gate. This was a 3-record series, if I'm not mistaken. I think the final one features Chick Corea. If you're into his piano playing, I don't know if I put him in this list. If I didn't, I should have, so I'm going to mention him here. Chick Corea, founding member of Return to Forever, and just an overall great jazz pianist. Anyways, Herbie Mann, live at the Village Gate. This is recorded, as it says, live at the Village Gate. He's a jazz flute player. This whole series is worth having. It is not too fusiony. It's not too funky. It's pretty straightforward jazz effort. I think this is an essential in any jazz collection. This is something different. This is an ECM release. ECM releases, in my experience, are not for everyone. They're a little contemporary for some people. They're a little smooth for some people. This album features Jaco Pastorius, who I have not hit on yet, although I will in great detail in a little bit. Pat Metheny is an excellent guitar player. Just such a pleasant, soothing, relaxing tone. If you're looking to get hyped up, if you're looking for upbeat, up-tempo, maybe leave this album to the side. This is late night, soothe your soul listening. Oliver Nelson, kind of a sleeper name in jazz. Oliver Nelson was primarily an arranger. He's notated as an arranger or not credited as an arranger on a number of jazz albums. This was his own album, and it has the lineup of the century: Freddie Hubbard, Roy Haynes, Bill Evans, Eric Dolphy, and Paul Chambers on Impulse. This is killer. Jaco Pastorius. I've got two of his albums set up. This is his first solo album. Jaco Pastorius started out as a session musician. He played with Joni Mitchell. He played with Blood, Sweat, and Tears. He played on Pat Metheny's first album. They were both pretty young at that point in time. This was his first solo album, 1976. He got signed with Columbia Records, and somehow, for his first solo effort, managed to put together a roster of absolutely unforgettable musicians, like Randy and Michael Brecker. It's got David Sanborn, Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter, Lenny White, Hubert Laws. I mean, this list is unreal. It's got the Charlie Parker cover of Donna Lee, which absolutely showcases and just further reinforces him being one of the best bass guitarists ever to live. He died young. It was tragic. There is currently a documentary about him on Hulu that is well worth the watch. This album, I've owned 3 copies of it. I cannot recommend it enough. This is in probably my top 5 favorite albums of all time. Let's not forget his live album. Jaco played with The Weather Report, which I'll touch on at the end. In case you haven't noticed, I am at least attempting to go in alphabetical order. This is Jaco's live album. What's it called? Invitation? Whatever. Yeah, Invitation. Jaco had a way of putting together a fairly big band. As to where a lot of the albums I've shown you are trios, quartets, quintets, Jaco had a big, loud, boisterous, big band. He had some steel drum players that gave it a really nice, Caribbean vibe. He played the fretless bass. It's a very different sound that you don't find on all jazz records. If it's not for you, I apologize. You are definitely missing out. Love, Devotion, Surrender. What a perfect album. Carlos Santana might not be a name you categorize in jazz. He did do a fair amount of commercial hits, whether it be in the 90s with, I can't even remember that guy's name, Rob Thomas, or whether it be in the late 60s, like his Woodstock music, Black Magic Woman, Oye Como Va. It's rock and roll. Not all of his is. He had a good run in the 70s of excellent fusion albums. I don't know if I'd call this fusion. I don't know what I'd categorize this as, but it is, I file it under jazz all the way. It's got a few John Coltrane covers, The Life Divine, Naima, and The Love Supreme. Side 1 is exclusively John Coltrane, and then side 2 has a song by John McLaughlin, who is the other performing guitarist on this record with Carlos Santana. And then it has a traditional, let's call it, spiritual song arranged by Carlos Santana and John McLaughlin. This is one of my favorite albums by Santana, by far. That and Caravanserai. This is one of those albums that, like, you see it, it's affordable, it has an unassuming cover, it's $5, you buy it, and you give it away. Just share the love. Everyone needs this. This album's out there. This album's not going to be for everyone. Maybe don't listen to this if you're afraid of a pretty heavy Indian influence in your music. By that I mean lots of tabla drums, lots of weird instrumentation that is not native to Western culture of music. This was John McLaughlin's group known as Shakti, and there was in the 70s and 80s this kind of push to make some of that music come commercial. Ravi Shankar was one of the big names in bringing that music to America. This is another one of those albums that I highly advise you listen to if you're feeling adventurous, if you're feeling experimental, and you're not afraid of something a little different. I think I have 2 CTI releases in a row. I apologize. Stanley Turrentine. I don't have any of his stuff on Blue Note, or else I'd probably have that here. Stanley Turrentine is probably in my top 3 favorite jazz saxophone players. Him, Stan Getz, and John Coltrane. I know it sounds generic to have John Coltrane in that list, but there's reasons that he is remembered as one of the best saxophone players of all time. Or else I don't think he'd have the level of fame that he does. Anyway, Stanley Turrentine, another great release of his is Sugar on the CTI label. All of these are fairly affordable. Definitely worth listening to. Grover Washington Jr. Probably fourth in line, maybe. Fourth, fifth, sixth, somewhere up high for another one of my favorite saxophone players. This album should be anyone's introduction to funk. It is heavily funky. The track "Feels So Good" is good. If you like this one, "Mr. Magic" by Grover Washington's another one to listen to. Just a killer effort. And then, last but not least, I'm going to finish this off strong with just the fusioniest fusion of all. This is Weather Report, Mr. Gone. This album's so important to me because, again, it has Jaco Pastorius on it. Jaco Pastorius, after some solo albums, after some great efforts as a studio musician, as a session musician, he somehow worked his way into Weather Report and worked with Wayne Shorter and Joe Zawinul and took over Alphonso Johnson's place on the bass. And this album, along with really any Weather Report release, if you get into fusion, if you make it that far, don't forget the Weather Report. Don't do it. Anyways, this has been an enormous stack of records. This says it's been 31 minutes long. I apologize if you've made it this far. I appreciate it. I know this was a pretty heavily Avery influenced stack of records. You've probably seen me post many of these if you're in the Central Kansas Vinyl Collectors. A lot of these are on heavy rotation, but I'm not trying to put really out there super crazy stuff in your face. I'm trying to put something in your face that can just draw you in, grab your attention, and just lead you down rabbit holes. That's the best way I can explain jazz. It's just full of rabbit holes. You find one artist you like, and you just follow their discography. Who did they play with? What groups did they play with? What other headlining musicians did they play with? And it will never end. You will never run out of jazz to listen to. So if you didn't find what you're looking for here, maybe I can do another video, or I'm always just down to have a conversation, usually up till 3 or 4 in the morning. So hit me up, and let's talk jazz if you found something you like. So hopefully this video is somewhat educational or interesting to you. Hopefully you just had it on in the background. I'm horrified that even 3 or 4 people just stared at me rambling for 30 minutes. But anyways, I'm going to click the stop button. I hope you found something of value here, and keep spinning.